Okay, welcome back to week 3, I believe. This is class 5 of Legal Studies 160, Punishment, Culture, and Society. Today's lecture is Punishment and Community. Just a couple of notes on readings. Hopefully you'll have discovered that when I assign a reading that's not a journal article or something that's accessible through the digital library, I'll have put it in PDF form in the resources section, and I now have more clearly labeled it Readings 2012. There's also a reading for my 2010 course. Some of the readings from that course that I'm not using this term are in there, so if you want to read more, you may be able to find some additional materials there. I'll try to add some of the electronic library articles there in case some of you have trouble accessing them. But at any rate, that's the place to look unless it's on the web. So before I plunge into today's material on Durkheim and community and punishment, let me just ask if there's questions left over from our lectures or discussions of last week. All right. So in a way, this is a transitional class. We've been looking last week especially at various accounts of what motivates punishment. And we've been looking to what other disciplines can teach us about the motivations for punishment. We began studying the extreme condition that punishment in California is in. So we're in a sense starting the course with a question. How do we get so punitive? What explains California's sort of hyper-punitive condition in this current decade, the crisis we're in? In a sense, we'll be trying to answer that question all semester, so don't be too frustrated if you don't feel like you have a good answer yet. But especially since you'll be writing a paper along the way, I hope you'll be thinking about some topics toward answering a small part of that question you might want to take on yourself. But in any event, last week we looked at, in many ways, the classic motivations of punishment that we associate with the rationales of punishment. Retribution, deterrence, incapacitation, rehabilitation. These are mainly associated with disciplines that deal with the individual as the unit of analysis, in particular psychology, economics, to some extent philosophy, which attempts to understand sort of human cognition in its core principles. This week, and with this class, we're making a transition to sociological accounts. This will be, in a sense, the first of several sociological accounts of punishment that we'll look at. And I think a particularly appropriate transition sociological bridge, in a sense. One, because, as I think you'll appreciate, having read the chapter of Durkheim I asked you to read, which is and maybe you didn't appreciate because it's a very hard chapter, and I hope to enlighten it a little bit more for you, that he very much resonates with some of the themes of retribution and what you might think of as the moral psychology of punishment that we looked at last week. But at the same time, he's not, as a scientist, as a theorist, if you will, he's not trying to explain the level of individual response, which is, after all, what the psychologist wants to do at the end of the day. Durkheim instead is trying to give an account of punishment as a social institution. And as you'll see, although we're going to continue to learn from and be informed by psychology, economics, and philosophy, as our study moves toward sort of comparative and historical look at punishment and its development toward mass incarceration, certainly not the end of history, one hopes, but a juncture in it, we will find ourselves looking at a level that's much closer to Durkheim's. It's much more of a sociological account. And we'll see that there's alternatives to Durkheim. Nonetheless, I'm particularly happy to start with Durkheim because I think if forced to choose just one social theorist to take with you to that mythical desert island, Durkheim could be your guy. And I say that even as a fan of many other, some of the social theory toolkits that will study this term, including the Marxist tradition, Foucault, Bourdieu, and others that I will have the opportunity to introduce you to. As time goes by, I discover more and more in Durkheim. It's one of the benefits of getting to teach this material every couple of years or so. One learns more. So let me tell you a little bit about Durkheim. For those of you that are legal studies students or just generally interested in legal phenomena, Durkheim is, again, a very valuable toolkit. There's almost no area of law that you can't get some, I think, interesting insights from Durkheim. But, and this is true of many social theorists, he was probably wrong about more than he was right. But, looking back at somebody's career, a century later, with the kind of empathy that I hope people will look at my career and your careers from that future point. And we can see that the little bit that he gets right is extraordinarily valuable, especially if we can separate it with the benefit of hindsight from the vast amount that he gets wrong. So who was Durkheim? Well, he's best known to us today as, quote, one of the fathers of sociology. Sociology as a science didn't really exist at this point. The term had been used by Quetelet, an earlier 19th century French statistician or economist. And obviously it fits with the whole creation of the ologies in the 19th century. If there's a social, then there must be a sociology to study it. Durkheim himself, as has been true of, and probably is still true of many French academic professionals, was trained as a philosopher. And so he certainly knew Kant and much of the other material that we've looked at. He had studied Bentham and the economic philosophy of rational action and rational choice. His professional teaching was actually in the field of education. Because the French university system, as ours was true of ours in the early 20th century, late 19th century, was largely set up to train teachers. But it was in this, in lecturing on education, that he really began to expound on the theory of social organization that we now associate him with. And he began to give lectures almost as a supplement to his main lectures on education on topics like suicide, the religious experience, education itself, of course, law, and crime. Two other things that are important about Durkheim, in, I think, thinking about his theory of crime and punishment, and that is that he, within the context of France at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, he's both a liberal and a Jew. Right? So, and those two are closer. There's a lot of liberals that aren't Jews in France at that time, and there's certainly some Jews that are liberals. But for liberalism at the end of the 19th century, across Europe, Jews are an embodiment of, in some ways, the liberal problem, which is to say, can you be a real citizen of a national political entity if you are not one of us, sort of religiously, ethnically, etc.? Can the nation state tolerate, if you will, the diversity of a citizenship that doesn't follow the same profession, that is faith, not profession in an occupational sense. And so the question of, this is why Marx writes an essay called On the Jewish Question, which is just a version of this question: can the nation state deal with a subject, a citizen, as a secular individual rather than as part of a faith community? For Durkheim and for many French liberals, this issue comes together very forcefully around the whole issue of the Dreyfus affair. Dreyfus was a French military officer of Jewish origins in the aftermath of the disastrous French defeat to the Germans in 1870. As Germany would do a couple generations later, France turned around and asked who could have betrayed us that we would lose to our traditional rivals, and answered the same way the Germans would a couple generations later. The Jews must have really favored the Germans, something that we might think of as surprising today from what we know from history, but certainly there was a lot of French anti-Semitism in this period. Dreyfus was accused of having betrayed the French cause, a traitor. It turned out later that his main accusers were essentially the real traitors, as sometimes happens. He was packed off to Devil's Island, which was sort of the epitome of the most terrible kind of punishment other than death that you could have, essentially transportation to some kind of slave labor in a desert island of some sort. I shall show you a picture of, at least a French newspaper picture of what it might have looked like. That doesn't look that bad, but certainly it was supposed to be a terrible place. He was stripped of his military honors and whatnot in a public degradation ceremony. Anyway, the newspaper headline you see here is the famous rejoinder to the Dreyfus conviction and punishment. This was a front-page editorial written by Zola, of course, I don't know why I'm forgetting his name, it's right there in front of us, the great French novelist and social theorist, social thinker, Jacques, in which he accused the French state of trumping up the charges against Dreyfus. Now, this debate became the great cause of sort of liberalism versus a certain form of anti-Semitic conservatism, if you will, or religious traditionalism at the beginning of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And Dreyfus was essentially vindicated. His cause was vindicated. Ultimately, he was shown to have been wrongfully convicted. And not only was this a huge triumph for the cause of Jews in France, I suppose, but it was a huge triumph for the parties that had supported the Dreyfus cause, which in France were basically university-educated intellectuals, especially people engaged in what we would now call the social sciences. And so for Durkheim, who's sort of moving into a university career, he takes a part on the Dreyfus side in this fight, although he's a minor player. But after it prevails, his career in some ways is moved by this because there's a lot more prestige associated with the French academic field at this point. But again, I think you'll see as we look at how Durkheim thinks about punishment, it's important to keep in mind the background of the Dreyfus affair, because I think it helps us understand some of the things that Durkheim, this was a sort of animated stage of the slides, I don't know quite how it got there. Okay, and so the book that you've read a section of is called The Division of Labor and Society. That's the English translation of it. It was essentially Durkheim's doctoral dissertation, although don't get too excited because doctoral dissertations meant a little bit more in those days. It wasn't the gateway to your teaching career. It was sort of when you got tenure, you had to essentially write a dissertation. Still a very impressive book. He writes this actually before the Dreyfus affair comes to a head, which is interesting. And in this book, he uses law as a window, basically, into the organization of society. Now, what I want to use it for, and what many people have used it for since, is to, although Durkheim is, in a sense, using crime and criminal law and punishment as a way to tell a larger story about the evolution of social organization, the rise of a division of labor in society, I want to sort of put that to the back of the train because we're most interested in his theory of crime and punishment. So there's basically three things I want to sort of cover that this chapter gives you at least a window into. And parts of it are, I won't say badly written, because who knows what good writing was for 1893, and it's a very different writing style than most of us are used to reading, so it's a bit hard. But let me see if I can tease out three separate sort of lessons from this chapter. One would go to Durkheim's theory of crime. The second would go to Durkheim's theory of punishment. And the third is sort of Durkheim's account of the evolution of social solidarity and how that's revealing itself or playing out in penal transformations. So I tried to de-animate these slides. Sorry about that. Annoying. So let me just sort of summarize the main points in case you fall asleep in the heat of this room before I can get to a fuller exposition. So first on crime. For Durkheim, he needs to answer the question, or he wants to answer the question, which is a foundational question for a lot of philosophers and students of law, and that is, what is crime? And as we'll see, Durkheim has what may seem like a cleverly tautological answer to it, but one that is actually quite radical and quite productive, and that is to say, crime is whatever we think it is, basically. Rather than running around the world trying to collect examples of crimes and seeing if we can boil them down to the essence of a crime, what Durkheim recognizes is that crime is whatever it is that evokes in people a passion to punish the actor. Punishment, as we'll again develop in a little bit more detail, is the other side of this. So whereas for many of Durkheim's contemporaries, as we've already seen, there's a hot debate about what the real rationale of punishment is, whether it should be sort of moral balancing or some kind of utilitarian manipulation that will reduce crime through deterrence or intimidation or incapacitation. Instead, Durkheim says punishment simply is the response from an outraged society to this breach of its moral order. And then finally, to anticipate the third point, although Durkheim will insist, perhaps too much, that we can learn a great deal about the role of punishment in society from studying primitive, whereas I'm not even sure to use the term primitive, we should probably use the term pre-modern or traditional societies. But as society becomes more modern, Durkheim will argue, although it keeps some of the core of shared moral norms that primitive society is all about, modern society becomes much more dependent on other forms of solidarity that are less moralistic, less oriented in essentially punitive, less anchored in these kind of emotional punitive responses, and more associated with the division of labor itself. And in terms of the legal system, this will give rise to the areas of law that we think of as civil law, litigation, the law of civil injuries, the law of labor relations, etc. And so Durkheim will have a striking proposition for legal studies students. He'll basically say, when you study the legal code of any society, you are basically getting a pictogram of its social consciousness, the way it's organized. Very traditional societies will be virtually all penal law, and as you get to a more modern society with a elaborated division of labor, you should expect to find a lot more of the sort of civil law. There'll still be a penal law, but it'll now be surrounded by reams of volumes of laws dealing with professional associations, with the family, etc. So you can imagine going to the library, a law library, as it were, a very traditional society, maybe the Code of Hammurabi or the Pentateuch, the Torah, would somehow be nothing but a penal code. But when we studied, say, the legal code of pre-revolutionary France, that would be already a lot more evidence of other forms of law, and then finally the modern France of the Third Republic, presumably, full elaboration of the kind of modern legal system that we associate today. So let's focus in on the crime and punishment. And again, it's as wrong as Durkheim was about many things, it's helpful to see him as a foil to some of the dominant thinking about both crime and punishment in his time that also influences our time. Right? So again, he rejected any approach to studying crime by running around the world collecting different crimes and trying to find the shared characteristics. As he liked to point out, nothing varies more than the sort of what counts as a crime. So that, in some countries in the world today, it might be a crime for a woman to walk around without a veil. It's a very religiously Islamic country, for instance. Whereas in France, if a law that's recently been adopted by the General Assembly there may make it a crime to wear a veil. Right? So you might ask, how could both not wearing a veil and wearing a veil be a crime, albeit in two different societies? And Durkheim, of course, would not have been surprised at all. He would say it just expresses the fact that the veil stands and its presence either its absence evokes a rupture of some social norms in a traditional Islamic society, and in a perhaps an insecure French modern society, wearing the veil may violate a strong sense of moral values, by some people at least. He also rejects the idea in the same way that we should see crimes as somehow uniquely anchored in the harm that they do society. He points out that if you look at traditional legal codes, often what is punished are things that don't involve what we would normally think of as crime today at all. So the capital crimes that were capital crimes in 17th century Massachusetts, for instance, included blasphemy, adultery. Those were some of the most essential crimes. And as we'll see, for Durkheim, this makes a lot of sense because he thinks religion is sort of the original fount of most crimes. And again, while people in his era, are, and to our day as well, are primarily concerned with debating which form of punishment or which way of understanding punishment will most bring out its effective ability to reduce crime, Durkheim is an ever-present reminder that the real purpose of punishment is not to reduce crime, but to essentially complete the moral experience that crime begins by sparking a sense of moral outrage when people learn of a crime. And the punishment is the satisfaction of the sort of energetic cycle that is formed. And it's very interesting. We don't have time to get fully into Durkheim's intellectual context, but he's going to essentially college with figures like the noted French psychologist Pierre Janet, who was a slightly ahead of Freud in the development of European psychology, and also with some of the inventors of electrical physics and electromechanics. And this is an era when the electricity is being essentially developed and understood, and many of Durkheim's metaphors, as is true for Freud and Janet and some of the other psychologists, are electrical metaphors of. And so you can imagine the crime punishment cycle as a kind of circuit, almost, where outrage at a crime sparks a reaction, a demand for punishment. The punishment creates essentially a full circuit and returns the state to a kind of moral equilibrium. So let's go over these in a little bit more detail. Crime for Durkheim simply is whatever violates the content of our common consciousness, which is at the core of our social solidarity. He writes in this chapter, the bond of social solidarity to which repressive law, a word he uses for penal law, corresponds is one, the breaking of which constitutes the crime. We use the term crime to designate any act which, regardless of degree, provokes against the perpetrator the characteristic reaction known as punishment. So again, there is no defining feature to crime. It's not like to be a crime something has to be harmful in a material way. Any theory you can come up with, Durkheim will suggest, of what all crimes share is going to fail because there's going to be some crimes that don't capture it. Instead, crime simply is whatever offends these most deeply held moral values. And of course, that can change over time, and it can be different in different places. Now, it's worth noting here and observing some of the vulnerabilities of Durkheim's methodology. How does he know so much? And of course, this is also the beginning of anthropology and comparative history as sort of developed sciences in this period. This is the era of European colonialism, so there's a lot of information coming back to Europe about so-called primitive societies, of course, all tied up with the experience of colonization as well, something that we'll note as well a bit later. But for Durkheim, this flow of information about more traditional societies in Africa and Asia, along with his own understanding as a learned Frenchman of the late 19th, early 20th century of classical history, the Roman Greek period, the ancient Hebrew period, convinces him that when we look at primitive societies, or I should say traditional non-modern societies, we're looking at our own true, the sort of social nature that we have in a pure, easier to understand form. He writes here, legal conceptions in the lowest forms of society are as worthy of consideration as those in the highest forms. And here he evokes very much the Darwinian science of his time. It would be like the biologist whose definition of living phenomena would be very inexact if he had scorned to observe single-cell entities. So in other words, he says, imagine biologists deciding that single-cell creatures are too uninteresting and trying to understand complicated multi-cell organisms like animals sort of directly without having studied the basic biology of the cell. And of course, today, even more than in his day, biology is cell biology and down from there. And so he again thinks, and the organic metaphor is a very clear one for him. For Durkheim, every society is to some extent a self-contained organism that has to reproduce itself. And while they didn't know about DNA in Durkheim's day, as we do, but they certainly assumed that there were mechanisms in the cell that kept that cell producing the same kind of cell. Durkheim thought that society as well had to have organs that would reproduce itself. And of course, what is he a professor of? He's a professor of education. So naturally, he thinks education is one of the most important ways that society produces itself. And of course, as you'll see in this chapter, he thinks that law and the criminal law is one of the most important ways that society reproduces itself. And traditional societies are very attractive to him because, in a sense, they reveal, when we look at them, the essence of how crime and punishment work, but in a pure form. And this is a very badly blown up photo here, and I'm glad in a way, because it just defines to kind of represent sort of Durkheim's image of traditional society and punishment. If you are relying on Google Image, you will find pictures of, for instance, current forms of capital punishment that involve stoning or beheading in some Islamic countries. And of course, the moment you find yourself thinking, oh, well, that's a picture of primitive punishment, you should of course stop yourself and ask, well, there's nothing not necessarily ancient about, actually, if you studied how these punishments were being used in these current societies, they're much more tied up with current politics around the meaning of Islam as a political project, etc., than they are reflective of some unchanging mentality associated with these countries. But Durkheim, my point is, wasn't making that distinction. He was sort of looking at the world that he could see through the lens of European colonialism, and instead of seeing a complicated reaction to this intersection between Europe and these other societies, he saw what he thought was this primitive culture that revealed the true nature of European society in a simpler form. Now, we're going to be hopefully a little more critical than that, but it's important to understand where Durkheim's ideas are coming from, because just to telegraph where I'm ultimately going to go with in terms of what you can take away from Durkheim, his study of primitive society is basically rubbish, but what it allows him to do is see some very insightful things about modern society. So even though his account of pre-modern society is largely incorrect, what it allows him to do analytically is think about what is important in the project of modern society, and especially in its penal practices. Now, at the core of Durkheim's, so if what a crime is something that violates this deep set of collective beliefs, how is it that we don't, that we tend to punish crimes like murder, theft, robbery, etc., across the centuries in many places, etc.? Well, his answer is that these values aren't shifting all the time. In fact, they belong to fairly stable, deeply inscribed, he imagines, in our brains through evolution and through development, common beliefs. And so some of them, like thou shalt not kill, are going to be shared by many societies and are going to endure over time. And so for Durkheim, when we look at what's being punished in any particular society, what we're doing is seeing a sort of representation of a core set of beliefs that themselves do not change, that are long-lasting. And this is what he comes to call the collective or common consciousness. And this is what really makes Durkheim the father of sociology, because he wants to say, it's true that we're all individuals, and we live and die as individuals to some extent. And he goes in so far as to say, we sort of have dual consciousnesses. We have one consciousness, which is sort of us as individuals, our personality, our ambitions, etc. But he says we have this other consciousness, which is of a collective type. And this isn't so far from notions like Jung's notion of a collective archetype, etc. But he thinks that there's a kind of, if you will, racial memory, but he doesn't think of it in a racist way, that is being not necessarily passed down in a genetic sense, but inculcated through education, through going to church, and